For the benefit of those who haven't been with us for a couple of weeks or our guests this morning, we're currently making our way through the book of Mark. We are in Mark chapter 3. That is your prompt to take out your devices or your Bible and go there if you would like. Mark chapter 3. But the way in which we're doing this is through narrative style. The preachers are essentially adopting the persona of someone who walked with Jesus in that time, who have a perspective, and they are bringing that perspective to us this morning from that individual, from their experience. And we are blessed this morning to have one of the apostles with us. All right. The Lord bless you. Give him a warm round of applause.
Okay. I've been following Jesus of Nazareth for about a month or two, a short period of time. But I want to tell you that in that short period of time, I'd experienced more excitement, more joy, more thrill, more wonder than I had in my entire lifetime put together. I mean, I'd seen him heal a man with leprosy, an incurable disease, with a touch. I'd seen him heal a man who had been paralyzed with the word of his mouth. I'd heard teachings the likes of which mortal ears had never heard before. There truly was never a dull day as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. And the crowds loved him. And he grew in popularity amongst the crowds. But along with the growth in his popularity came a growth in the opposition against him. My Hebrew name is Simon or Simeon. But many of you may know me as by the name that Jesus gave me, Peter. And this morning, I'm so grateful that you're allowing me to share a few of the experiences I had as a follower of Jesus with you. It was the Sabbath day, which of course for us as the Jewish people was a Saturday. And as was our custom, we as the disciples, along with Jesus, went to the local synagogue in Capernaum. And there was a man there with a shriveled hand. It was crippled. It was deformed. It was his right hand. And the religious leaders, the Pharisees, they were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they were watching him closely to see if he would heal this man on the Sabbath day. You see, you must remember that God had given us as the Jewish people his law on Mount Sinai. He had given the law to Moses, the 10 commandments. Do not steal, do not murder, do not commit adultery, all those things. But one of the laws was to keep the Sabbath day holy, that we as the Jewish people were to do no work on the Sabbath day. And the reason God gave us this command, this law, was because he knew what was best for us as his creation, as his people he had made. He knew that as human beings we get tired and that we need a day of rest, a day where we can cease from our labor, a day of rejuvenation. He knew that we needed a day where we could come together as his people and focus solely on him, on the Lord, hear his word being preached and worship together and have fellowship like what we're having here this morning. And then maybe afterwards we could have meals with one another, and if there was a need in the community, we could fulfill that need. We could help those people because we were so busy on the other days of the week. In other words, it was supposed to be a day of rest, rejuvenation, joy, freedom. But what had happened over the centuries is that the religious leaders, the Pharisees, had come up with their own interpretation and traditions of what the law meant, of what it meant to keep the Sabbath day holy, of what it meant to rest. Dozens and dozens and dozens of laws. Don't do this. Don't do that. Don't touch this. Don't touch that. Abstain from this. Abstain from that. Dozens and dozens of them. So that it become more of a burden, the Sabbath day, than a delight. It was all about rule keeping and maintaining these meticulous little details of the law, of their interpretation of the law. One of the laws, one of the traditions that they had come up with was that you were not allowed to help another person on the Sabbath unless it was a matter of life and death. If it was a matter of life and death, you could help them. If it was not a matter of life and death, You couldn't help them. That would be considered work. And so here you have this man in the synagogue with this crippled hand. That's not a matter of life and death. He's not bleeding to death. Jesus can wait till Sunday, till Monday, till Tuesday, any other day of the week to heal the man. What's he going to do? This was the question on everybody's mind. And Jesus stood in front of the synagogue like I'm standing in front of you today. And he called the man with the shriveled hand up. He was sitting here in the front, and he came up and he stood beside Jesus. And then Jesus looked over the synagogue at the religious leaders, and he said this, "What is lawful to do on the Sabbath?" He said, "To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. And then Jesus looked at them, and I could see that he was angry. He was deeply distressed at their stubborn, at their hard hearts. I could see it. Jesus never got angry. In all the years I followed him, he never once did I see him get angry in the sense of when he was personally assaulted. He would always turn the other cheek. He would never retaliate, as he had taught us as his followers in the Sermon on the Mount. But he was angry that day. You know why? Because these Pharisees, these religious leaders, whom he loved, by the way, he loved them deeply, but they had elevated their traditions and their laws above the needs of another human being, above the needs of a person made in the image of God. They'd missed the very spirit and intent of the law that was always to love God and to love one another. That if there's the opportunity to do good, to help someone else, do it, no matter what day of the week it was. And Jesus was angered by that and distressed that they had made these traditions higher than the needs of this man. Then he said to the man, "Now stretch out your hand." And the man, you can imagine he was apprehensive. He didn't know what to do. He can't stretch out his hand. It's crippled. But he took Jesus at his word, and he took a step of faith, and he began to stretch it out. And as he did so, his hand was completely restored, just as sound as the other one. You can imagine this man's joy, this man's delight. For the first time, he's got the use of his hand. He's going to be able to do things like work. He's never been able to find proper work in his life. His whole life has been turned around by Jesus. He was overcome with joy, with astonishment, as were all of us sitting in the synagogue that day. We couldn't believe what we'd seen. Another miracle. I sat there thinking, once again, who is this Jesus? Who is this one with such compassion, with such power? Do you know what the Pharisees did? They went out and plotted with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. How sad. Instead of them taking a step back and thinking to themselves, who is this? Could this be the Messiah that we've been waiting for 2,000 years? They're filled with jealousy. They're jealous of him. They see him as a threat to their traditions that they've created. He's going to come and take everything away from them, they thought. And they went out and plotted how they might kill him. That's what religion and legalism can do, how it can blind a person. Jesus became aware of this opposition, and he knew that the hour had not yet come for this opposition to intensify. So he said to us as the disciples, "Come, we need to leave the synagogue. We need to get away from here." And so we did. We went to this lake, the Lake of Tiberias. It was also known as the Sea of Galilee. Very well-known lake in Galilee in the north of Israel. And we wanted to go there, and we might be alone for a period of time. But of course, by this time, as I've already mentioned, Jesus is so popular, he cannot go anywhere without the crowds noticing him. It's like in your world, maybe a Cristiano Ronaldo type thing, Can't go anywhere without being noticed, anywhere in the world. So Jesus was noticed by the crowds, and this large crowd from Galilee followed us to the lake. And when people got wind of where he was going, they came from the south, from Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and the region across the Jordan, and as far north as Tyre and Sidon, a Gentile region. Both Jew and Gentile alike came that day to hear this man teach, to be healed of their sicknesses, of their diseases. And people came with all types of diseases and sicknesses and pain, and the paralyzed, and those suffering seizures, and the demon-possessed. They came to him, and Jesus healed them all, every single one of them, with a touch, with the word of his mouth. You know, in all the years that I followed Jesus, never once did I ever see him turn away someone who came to him for healing. He always ministered to them with such love and compassion. When some people in the crowd saw what was happening, the way Jesus was healing everybody, they themselves, who were also ill and were diseased and had diseases, they became desperate just to touch him. They thought, if we can just touch this man that is so anointed, so filled with the Spirit, we too can be healed. It was like this other time that I'd been following Jesus, and this woman with this issue of blood who'd been bleeding for 12 years came up. She'd spent all her money on doctors and wasn't able to be healed. She thought, if I can just touch him, if I can just touch his clothing, I will be healed. And she did. She touched his clothing, and instantly she had been healed. It was like that on this day. They thought, if we can just touch him. And it became chaotic. People were being pushed out of the way in the crowd. They were falling down. They were sort of diving forward to just touch his clothing, that they might be healed by this anointed one. It got so chaotic that Jesus said to us as the disciples, please have a boat ready for me that I can get away from the edge of the water, because the crowds, they're going to crush me. When those who had been delivered of demon possession, when the demons came out and they recognized Jesus, they cried out, you are the Son of God. But he gave them strict orders not to tell who he was. You see, the hour for his true identity to be revealed had not yet come. That would come in a few years from then, but the hour had not yet come for his true identity to be revealed. What a day it was. That day alone gave me enough memories to last me 5 entire lifetimes. Now, on another occasion, Jesus had said to us as the disciples that he was going onto a particular mountainside to pray, and that he was going to be there the entire night in prayer with the Father. He told us we couldn't follow him that particular night. It always amazed me as a follower of Jesus that while he was fully God, he was fully man at the same time. And so he completely depended upon the Father in prayer. He did nothing but the will of his Father. So he goes to spend the night in prayer. The next day, he told us that we could come find him on this particular mountain. So we went there the next day to the mountain he had told us about. And we arrived. Now you must understand that at this time, it wasn't just the 12 disciples following him. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of disciples following him, maybe 1,000. So we all arrived there at this mountain. Jesus came and he was teaching us and having fellowship with us and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, he begins to call certain individuals aside from this crowd. One by one, calls us aside. There were 12 of us that he called aside. And we kind of went a little bit away from the rest of the disciples, and Jesus said to us 12, I am designating you as my 12 apostles after the 12 tribes of Israel. And you're going to be with me, you 12. I'm going to train you and teach you in ways that I haven't up to this point, in a more intense way. We're going to spend our lives together for the next 3 years, intimately. I'm going to train you and teach you. You'll be with me, and I'll send you out. I'm going to send you out to preach in the authority of my name, to heal the sick, to drive out demons, which we would do in the years to come, in the months to come. We would go and preach Jesus, and we would see people healed of all types of sicknesses and demon possession. We would go and put into practice what Jesus had modeled for us as the 12. These are the names of the 12 that Jesus chose that day. Simon, Peter, that's me. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, who was my brother. Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, shame, doubting Thomas. He gets a bad rap. He was a good guy. He was a good friend of mine, I promise you. Very good guy. James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and lastly, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. And to this day, friends, I don't understand why Jesus chose us 12. There were more gifted men in that crowd of disciples, people with better abilities. There were people with more learning than us 12. Myself and my brother were fishermen. We were just average people. Matthew, a tax collector, lowest of the low, hated by the Jews, collaborator with Rome, just average, ordinary people. But he chose us 12. I don't understand. But I know this, that time after time as a follower of Jesus, I saw him take men and women who the world would never expect to be used. And Jesus transformed their lives and did more through their lives than they and other people could ever have imagined. Just one person I want to mention again, and that's Judas Iscariot. You know, he started so well, Judas. I saw him preach Jesus. I saw him heal the sick. I saw him drive out demons. We would never have known that he'd be the betrayer. It didn't once enter our mind. He started so well, but his heart was not right with God. He became greedy. And in the end, he betrayed Jesus. And he will forever be known, not as the man who preached Jesus, but as the one who betrayed him. He didn't end the race well. I have one final story that I'd like to share with you this morning. It took place in Capernaum, which was the home base of Jesus. It actually took place in my home, myself and my brother's home, Andrew. Now, as always, throngs of people, crowded. The house where we were, inside and out. You could barely move. In fact, it was so chaotic that we as the disciples and Jesus couldn't even eat. There was no time to eat. This is how chaotic and packed it was that day. One of the people from the house where we were, they knew Jesus' family well. So they kind of went up to the house of Jesus' family. It was probably about 1 kilometer away to tell them what was happening, how Jesus wasn't even eating. When their family, Jesus' family, heard about this, they wanted to come and take charge of him because they thought he's gone out of his mind. He's mad. Even Jesus' own family thought that he was mad. They didn't understand who he was. They doubted him. I saw his brothers, during the time I followed Jesus, mock him at times. It was only after his death and resurrection that they came to fully understand who he was. So they're on their way now to take charge of Jesus. But in the meantime, Jesus had healed a man who'd been demon-possessed. He'd been blind and mute by demon possession. The demon had come out. Some of the teachers of the law who had come up from Jerusalem made this blasphemous accusation against Jesus. They said, he is possessed by Beelzebub. It is only by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. You see, they couldn't deny his power. It was plain for everyone to see. Miracle after miracle, healing after healing. You couldn't deny that this man had power. You know what the only thing was left for them to do was to question the source of his power. That's not the power of God, they said. That's the power of Satan at work. He's possessed by Beelzebub, by Satan. Jesus replied in the way that only Jesus could. Wisdom incarnate. He said to them, how can Satan drive out Satan? He said. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. And a household divided against itself cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. You see what he's saying? He's saying it's a ridiculous notion to accuse me of being possessed by Satan, of driving demons out by the power of Satan. If that was the case, Satan would be self-defeat. He'd be defeating himself. Satan doesn't want to drive out demons. He wants people to be possessed by demons. It would make absolutely no sense for Satan to do that. I could see that the Pharisees were beginning to look a bit sheepish as Jesus said this to them. They knew it was a ridiculous accusation they'd made against him. And then he said this. He said, or how can anyone enter a strong man's house and carry off his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man? Then he can plunder his house. See what he's saying? He's saying, not only is it false to accuse me of driving Satan out by the power of Satan. No, it's the very opposite. I drive out Satan by the power of God, and that power is far greater than Satan. Satan is like the strong man that's been bound. He's utterly powerless to do anything about it. No, the power of God has come. The kingdom of God is at work, and Satan is utterly powerless to resist it. And then he said this. He made a very, very solemn statement. He said, I tell you the truth. All the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven. But the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. The person who does that is guilty of an eternal sin. That's a solemn statement. See what he's saying? He's saying, essentially, when a person looks at me as the Son of God, and they reject me over and over and over and over, and they harden their hearts to such a point that they can look at me, someone who is love and good and righteous and heals by the power of God and gives life, they can look at all of that and they can say, Satan. That's the power of Satan at work. Person who does that, that sin can never be forgiven. And quite frankly, friends, that person doesn't want to be forgiven. Their hearts have become that hardened. People sometimes say to me, Peter, I'm worried that I've committed the unforgivable sin. And I say to them, have you ever looked at the life of Jesus and said, that's Satan at work? And they say, we would never do such a blasphemous thing. I say to them, don't worry. You haven't committed the unforgivable sin. At that moment, as Jesus said those words, his family arrived outside. Remember how I said his family had made their way to take charge of him? Family arrives outside, and there was someone standing outside who they knew. They said to this person, please go in and call Jesus. Go and tell him that his mother and brothers are waiting outside for him. So this person came into the room where we were. We were kind of seated in a sort of circle. This person came in, said to Jesus, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. Jesus paused and said, who is my mother? And who are my brothers? I thought to myself, Jesus, what are you talking about? You know who your mother and your brothers are. And then he looked around at the circle of his followers and he said, here is my mother and here are my brothers. For everyone who does God's will is my sister and my mother and my brother. And I realized at that moment that Jesus wasn't talking about his physical family, but the family of God. And something within me, my heart leapt for joy, for I realized he was saying that I was part of his family. I was one of his brothers. Friends, I can tell you right now that if Jesus was standing here this morning, he would look around at you who are gathered here, you who believe in his name, and seek to do his will in your life. And he would point to you and say, here is my mother. Here are my brothers. Here are my sisters. Amen.